when I was looking at numbers and KPIs that we typically look at, things like capacity, demand, the LMI, the freight rejection reports, and things like that. There are times, and this is where you may argue that an AI interpretation of a number would be flawed. In other words, you can look at certain KPIs by merit, they have influencers behind them. So you could have a KPI, and I'll give you an example so we aren't talking completely hypothetical here. But if you have a KPI that's trending up or down, the real key is what's driving that up or down indicator. And sometimes you have mixed signals underneath. When you peel it back one layer and you look at the five or six things that comprise the KPI output, you see some competing things that are going up and down. So a good example last year was the LMI, the Logistics Managers Index, which is a common industry KPI for measuring warehousing, inventory, and transportation combined, capacity and pricing. And we were seeing some flatness or downward trends or upward trends in that, where in fact there were some broadly diverging factors that went into the overall composite score, meaning inventory was being built up early in the year, warehousing was being constrained, and transportation capacity looked really good, and prices weren't necessarily going up. Well, the LMI itself was recording what looked more like a stable environment when the fact is what was happening is anticipating going forward a burn down of that inventory in a more rapid cycle created some false sense of security around capacity. People were storing more inventory and taking longer to move it by the fact they had it on hand. So slower transit times were leveraging maybe different modes of transport where it appeared that there was extra capacity in the market for upcoming increases, as we talked about when we just talked about, right, in terms of unplanned things. So my point of all this is when you read the tea leaves, sometimes the tea leaves are confusing. The math gets more complicated in what you're seeing. And so you have to look at it not only from the surface level, but underneath. And the LMI is a good example. Another one would be, a lot of transportation specifically is a KPI that's cost per unit weight. So what's the general cost per unit weight to move a shipment from A to B? And if you think about the cost per unit weight, which is universal, right? It doesn't matter whether, the mode of transport per se, although it has more relevance in certain modes. Others are tracked by cost per shipment. But my point is if you look at the cost per unit weight, regardless of how much you ship, it's a KPI that's sort of independent of the volume. And so the objective of a well-run supply chain is to handle the scaling of capacity or demand without necessarily paying more per unit weight. In other words, I could produce more without increasing the cost per unit of weight I ship through the supply chain. And that cost per unit weight has several variables that create the movement up or down or flat of that KPI. Things like how much weight am I shipping per shipment? Because usually pricing isn't linear. It's asymptotic on a curve, right? So because you hit minimums and things like that. Fuel is an indicator in that cost. There are accessorial costs and things like that. So the key is to be very careful when you're reading the indicators and what's going on. And then I'll leave one last point on this, Cassandra, and that is you always want to look at trends. And I think I always ask myself, is this a blip or is this a trend? A blip is a transitory event that will eventually settle back into the previous state, right? And you got to be careful because if you overreact, you tend to miss the mark. So I think it's important to look at trends and not just the one point. So if you think of what happened during the tariffs, everybody was overreacting a bit to the increased costs, overstocked inventory. Maybe it played out in a way that you expected, maybe it didn't. And that actually lasted longer than I would have guessed too. But point being is look at the data and be careful you don't overreact to a blip But if you see a trend, then that's probably a good time to take the action to mitigate the negative impact of a trend, if that is the case, particularly to a supply chain.